to divide my remarks, and I'm going to keep them fairly brief into three sections. First, a quick update on what's happened with the Arms Trade Treaty. Second, some of the dangers I see with it going forward. And third, a look ahead to what I think will happen with the treaty and its implementation, both in the United States and around the world more broadly. As Frank pointed out, Secretary of State Kerry signed the Arms Trade Treaty on September 25th in an event at the United Nations. This was not a surprise. The administration had already said they were going to sign at some future date, and we in fact knew a month in advance that they were going to sign on the 25th. Secretary Kerry made some remarks when he signed the treaty. There was no formal signing statement, just a short series of remarks from Secretary Kerry. It was interesting that some of those remarks were clearly contradicted by the text of the treaty. Secretary Kerry indicated that the treaty recognized that both nations and individuals have an equivalent right to possess arms for self-defense. That is clearly untrue according to the treaty. The treaty recognizes the inherent national right of self-defense. It does not recognize an inherent individual right. Now, the question arises why the Secretary said this. One possibility is that he simply hadn't read the treaty, or that his advisors hadn't read the treaty with any care, and I don't want to rule that out. But I'm inclined to go for a more charitable explanation, which is that several of the previous congressional letters expressing concern about the treaty, a letter from Senator Tester and 11 of his colleagues in 2011, and a parallel Republican letter from Senator Moran, together comprising 57 senators, in 2011 expressed concerns precisely on the point of individual self-defense. So I think you're already starting to see an administration push to try to neutralize that really central argument. Another significant thing the Secretary said during his remarks, he praised the non-governmental organizations, the NGOs, all of them on the left, for their work in helping to get this treaty negotiated, and called on them to continue their good work in the months and years going forward. And that, in a nutshell, is pretty much exactly what I'm concerned about, that they will, in fact, continue their supposedly good work in months and years going forward. There's already been some Hill response to the U.S. signature. Senator Inhofe released a characteristically feisty letter in which he pointed out that the Arms Trade Treaty didn't really stand a chance in hell of being ratified by the Senate. Senator Corker wrote a more measured but very serious letter pointing out that the administration shouldn't try to implement the treaty until it was properly ratified and by the Senate and all of the appropriate procedural steps had gone through. I don't think the administration has any immediate plans to seek ratification of this treaty in the Senate. For one thing, I don't think they would be successful. For another, there are several treaties ahead in the queue from their point of view. Comprehensive test ban, law of the sea, disabilities, and perhaps one or two more. I suspect what they will do instead is rely on their ability, supposedly, to implement the treaty's object and purpose with existing legislative authorities, and I'd be happy to talk about exactly what those are. With that, let me segue to what I think the dangers of the treaty are. First, the treaty is now part of the U.S. administrative state. This is not just a foreign relations problem. This is a U.S. government writ large problem. And the treaty is one relatively small but fairly significant part of a gigantic administrative superstructure which has enormous ramifications but is expressed in very tangled bureaucratic ways that are very hard for outsiders to monitor, very hard for Congress to monitor, and they're very, very hard for anyone to really control. I find this particularly concerning because the treaty is so ambiguous, and the State Department has acknowledged that it is indeed ambiguous. A well-meaning State Department, a Reagan, for example, could interpret this treaty in ways that would render it not harmless, but much less harmless. A not well-meaning White House and State Department could take advantage of the ambiguity the other way. And those are sorts of bureaucratic administrative decisions that are very tough to really keep a hold of. I attended a talk by Van Diepen, who's PDAS at the ISN Bureau at State a few days ago, which really sort of shed some light on this. Van Diepen made the following series of comments, which are on the record. There are many things in the treaty that he says that have to be done sort of outside the treaty context before the treaty itself can actually be implemented. He seriously pointed out that the entire world needs to adopt the rule of law. Everyone needs to control their borders. Everyone needs to have an effective police and judicial system. Everyone needs to control the gray market and arms trafficking, and the entire world needs to collaborate against nations that traffic in arms illegitimately, and then the treaty would become effective and could actually be implemented. No, I'm serious.
And then the millennium would also.
Right. So on the one hand, this is farcical. On the other hand, it points out a rather interesting argument. The administration is now making the claim that there are many things that one has to do entirely outside the context of the treaty that are contained nowhere in it in order to effectively implement the treaty. What are the things the United States has to do outside the context of the treaty in order to effectively implement it? Is a question which I would very much like to see answered. The NGOs have, of course, continued to be active. Their basic line in the treaty, and indeed the entire sort of realm of international arms trafficking, is as follows. First, they are, in my view, fundamentally ambulance chasers. They never talk about Iran until Syria materializes. They never talk about Cuban, North Korean arms trafficking. They never talk about Venezuelan arms trafficking. They talk about whatever is bleeding on the headline news and the United States. And that is really it. Second, they emphasize the guilt or the responsibility of the United States, even as they simultaneously point out that we have the best arms export control system in the world. I think this gives you a pretty good sense of where the NGO leadership that Secretary Kerry called for is going to go. It is going to focus on the leading cases and particularly upon the United States. That leads me to the question of what's going to happen down the road. The Arms Trade Treaty is likely to have 50 national ratifications within 6 months, give or take. It will then be in effect for the parties that have signed and ratified it. I think there's likely to be a conference of state parties at the UN this summer, although that's not a slam dunk. Inside the United States, the Senate is unlikely to ratify the treaty in the near future. It will instead be implemented by the administration through the object and purpose requirements in ways that I've said earlier will be very hard to trace. I think you're very likely to see a strong Senate and House reaction against the treaty in the relatively near future. I would predict sometime fairly early next week. You will see some news breaking on this subject. In 6 years, we can look forward to a review conference for the treaty at which a large number of amendments will be proposed, and amendments do not have to be agreed on the basis of consensus. It's 3/4 majority rule, ultimately. The single most important amendment that's liable to come up, and the single focus of the agitation going forward, will be the idea that the treaty should ban the supply of arms to non-state actors. Russia has already announced that it will not sign the treaty until the treaty bans the supply of arms to non-state actors, like the rebels in Syria, for example. And the quickest way to promote the universality of the treaty among all of the states in the Middle East, except for Israel, of course, would be to, again, ban the supply of arms to non-state actors. That would also be a significant attack on the Second Amendment, because non-state actors are also individual firearms owners inside the United States. So I think you're liable to see an NGO push for this NSA ban coming both to promote the universality of the treaty and to sort of, entrench on the United States in 6 years' time. You'll see that campaign kicking off a lot sooner. My culminating point is that the U.S. needs to unsign this treaty. I don't have any illusions that's going to happen in the near future, but we need to unsign this treaty. That does not solve every problem that we have as a result of the treaty's existence, but it is an important first step. It gives us a basis for protesting a lot of the treaty's bad effects going forward. And I think this needs to be undertaken as part of a comprehensive process of treaty reform, whereby we unsign a number of other damaging treaties and reform the way we handle our international relations so that treaties return to being what they were intended to be by the Founding Fathers, which is genuinely responsible instruments of international affairs, not these aspirational documents that affect only the law-abiding and not the lawless.
Ted, thank you. 2 questions, if I could, quickly on sort of the general point. I didn't hear you. If I did, forgive me if I missed it. You made the point on our radio show recently that, and I think in previous comments here, that one of the ways this reaches out and grabs gun owners is through the fact that most guns now sold in the United States are manufactured at least in part elsewhere. So if you'd speak to that point, and secondly, on this last note, the issue of treaty reform, it would seem to me ought to start with this idea that we are obliged to observe treaties effectively indefinitely, even if the Senate isn't asked to ratify them or refuses to do so.
Yeah, two very different points. Let me take the firearms point first. Approximately 3 out of every 8 firearms sold in the United States every year is directly imported. So the U.S. firearms market is very international. And every major U.S. firearms manufacturer, in fact, most of the minor ones, have some sort of international parts, components, financing, insurance chain. The idea, which you will hear administration spokespeople put forward, that the treaty only affects the domestic market. There is no domestic market. The entire market is an international market. So that division is not a real one. So I'm rather skeptical on those grounds.
Can I just clarify something you said? Their position is that it won't have any effect because it doesn't affect the domestic market.
Yeah, their argument is that the treaty does not affect anything that is purely domestic. Well, almost nothing is purely domestic in this globalized era. So I don't think that's a very serious argument. On the second and very different point about treaty process reform, the idea behind respecting signed but unratified treaties used to be sort of a good one. Back when most treaties were bilateral, if you and I signed a treaty, and then before I ratified, I went and did all the things that were prohibited by the treaty, and then quick ratified it, maybe that's not quite illegal, but it's certainly dishonorable. So that was the idea behind the object and purpose requirement, was that you were supposed to behave like an honorable individual. But now that treaties are multilateral, they involve everyone in the room, and they are frequently extremely intrusive domestically, that is not simply about your foreign policy conduct, this idea of an object and purpose obligation has, I think, turned from a genuinely good idea into something that is destructive and subversive of the way treaties are normally supposed to be treated in the United States. So one step that I would advocate is that we change our system and say that we do not respect treaties until they have been signed and the Senate has given the full advice and consent, and any appropriate implementing legislation, if necessary, has passed through the House and Senate and received presidential signature. There are a number of other things. I would like to see treaties not be allowed to sit in the SFRC inbox for decades in some cases. There are many other steps that could be taken. But I think the object and purpose one is important. I don't want to make treaty reform the be-all and end-all. A lot of our international business is now done through executive agreements. And we should always bear in mind that if we make treaties tougher and tougher and tougher to do, we increase the temptation on presidents to, which is already extremely strong, to run out the back door and do executive agreements on everything. So I think it's important to balance the desire for genuinely constructive treaty reform while recognizing that that's not the be-all and end-all of ensuring that our foreign policy is democratically controlled and our international commitments are democratically controlled.
Right, thank you.
On that last point, what is the difference between what the Obama administration can do because they want to do certain things and what they'll be allowed to do with a signed treaty that hasn't been ratified? And as I understand it, it's only a matter of their purity of their motives. They still have the same power. Am I wrong there? Is that?
Well, I would put it a little differently than that. First, the two legislative authorities they will rely on is the Gun Control Act of 1968, which gives the president essentially unlimited power to regulate the import of firearms into the United States, and the Arms Export Control Act, as repeatedly amended, which gives broadly similar powers about the export of articles on the U.S. munitions list. So the legislative authorities exist, but what I would point out is that the Arms Trade Treaty contains reasonably specific requirements about holding international humanitarian law, international human rights law. And I could interpret that requirement in my conservative hat as being relatively meaningless and say, well, we're doing that already, tough luck. Or if I were Harold Koh, very much on the left, I could say, no, I don't think that arming this group of rebels is, follows the IHL, IHRO requirements. What I would say is that it adds another weight on the scales for those who want to put the weight on the scales to say that we have a treaty commitment, so-called, to do or not to do certain
You mean
things.
people within the administration?
Absolutely, and there
Will
was
have their case strengthened
Yeah.
to take the more activist.
the more hard-line approach, or perhaps soft-line approach, might be a more accurate way of putting it. There was a good article in the Wall Street Journal in mid-July on this, which pointed out that the administration tied itself in legal knots for almost 18 months because its lawyers could not agree that arming the Syrian rebels was legal under international law. Now, I personally don't think that was the wise policy to pursue, but that's a policy argument. There may be future rebel groups that we very much want to arm. And I'm very leery of any treaties or any commitments which give further weight to that international law argument and turn what should be a policy argument into a thou shalt not because it's against the law argument. And we know that that's already happened. The ATT is just another weight on the scale of the legalization of international affairs, which in my view is basically destructive.
Good. Any other questions? Yes.
As it said, is the Supreme Court and the judicial branch taking a referee role, or are there precedents where you've got a treaty out there, and despite not being ratified by the Senate, that administration's tried to implement it?
The Supreme Court will decide that this is a political dispute, and they're not going to touch this. And given the Gun Control Act and the Arms Export Control Act, the administration can make, I'm not a lawyer, so this is just my layman's assessment, but I think they can make a prima facie case that what they're doing is covered by existing legislative authorities, and they're just changing their internal decision rules about the way they apply existing legislative authorities. The Supreme Court is not going to touch that. It goes too deep into the executive branch. That's why I go back to the problem that what we really have here is an administrative state issue, and you have to understand things like the ATT within the broader context of the growth of the administrative state over the last 40 or so years.
Anyone else?
I have another question if nobody else does. Real quickly, I think I've asked you this before. I just can't get my arms around this idea. You're saying that if we do ratify this treaty, and then it's subsequently amended by the mechanism that does not include our approval, we would still be bound potentially by the additional amendment?
How can I answer but yes and no? No, in the sense that the treaty states that amendments are only binding on the nations that accept them. So that's the no, and that sounds good. The yes, unfortunately, is that the treaty as amended will then become the normative standard for judging the export and indeed the import of everything that it covers. Van Diepen, in his talk at IISS the week before last, said in closing, treaties have normative power even for those who have not signed or ratified them. As a matter of practice, nations rarely violate these normative standards. Now, I think that's a bunch of nonsense because there are plenty of commitments, in spite of all of these supposed normative standards, that are violated all the time. But that gives you an idea of the U.S.'s view, or at least this administration's view, of the power of the normative standards inherent in an amendment that we didn't even accept ourselves. So again, it's a weight on the scale problem, not a sort of black and white thou shalt or shalt not problem.
By normative, you mean customary international law? And if so, would the fact that we didn't ratify an amendment show that we're objecting to that customary?
There are two radically different interpretations of customary international law out there. One is the interpretation that was basically held by the founding fathers, who called it the law of nations. And that is that customary international law is the well-settled, established practice of states. I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing that there are some really basic ground rules in international relations, and they do genuinely express well-settled practice. I think that's very reasonable. But the new interpretation of CIL is that it's constructed by UN General Assembly resolutions, treaties that are signed but which no one respects, the statements of legal authorities, journalists, academic conferences, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, it's not actually grounded in well-established practice. So under the old interpretation, I agree with you completely. Under the new interpretation, you can have a treaty or even a treaty amendment, and there are many serious legal scholars who will say this constitutes CIL even though it's not actually the long and well-established practice of states. And then the weight on the scale problem reemerges.
Can I ask, if you're right, and I suspect you are, that the government is going to now find that it has a new stick with which to beat us on gun control, how soon do you think that would begin to manifest itself? Do you think that there's some decent interval that has to apply when they're pretending that they're going to do something?
I'm sure that political considerations enter into it here, and I don't do politics, so I'll let people who know more about it than I do. I think this is going to be crisis-driven. Just as the Cluster Munitions Convention was driven by supposed Israeli misbehavior, just as the Landmines Convention was driven fundamentally by Lady Diana, just as the ATT was driven supposedly by the Victor Bout case, I think you will see episodes of tightening by the U.S. and other governments against individual kinds of weapon systems, individual companies, individual countries, very, very spotty. For example, this is not ATT related, but it's significant. About 2 months ago, the Obama administration banned the import of surplus Korean War vintage M1 Garands on the grounds that this was a crime control measure. Now, I mean, maybe I'm missing something, but I haven't caught a gigantic crime wave in the United States committed by people running around with 3.5-foot long Korean War vintage rifles. Maybe I haven't read enough news recently. This is laughable. But this is the kind of targeted move on the import side that I think the ATT facilitates, at least mentally and to a certain extent so-called normatively. But it's case by case.